Oh, that's a good sound. Alright, you guys, welcome back to Reignited and our Twin Charged Magnum project. Now, if you didn't see the last episode, we made the monumental step of getting this engine fired up for the very first time. However, as you saw, it would only run for a second or two and then it would die. Now, initially I attributed that to just needing to make some changes on the fuel tables, maybe give it some more fuel, keep it running. But upon closer inspection, that was not the only issue that we were facing. Certainly it is an aspect of it, but there was other things involved. Now, any sort of fuel injection system, the engine is relying on a number of sensors to give it data to say, okay, these are the parameters we're working with right now. And the computer then says, okay, based on that data, this is how much fuel, this is how much spark we need to have, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'm simplifying here, but that's the essential nature of it. So one of the things that I've realized now that I've been working with the HP tuner system for a little bit now is that you can't just choose whatever sensors you want and then scale them to match and make it work. I thought you could because that's how most complete standalone systems do. A lot of times they'll even have a little drop down box where you can say, okay, this sensor is what I'm doing. The computer will automatically input that data and interpolate the information like it should. That's not the case with HP tuners, which I should have done more research to figure that out beforehand, but I didn't. So in this case, one of the things that we had going on is that I was using a GM air intake temp sensor. Now, these things are used very widely across the industry. They have very well-known resistance values. Now, if you're not aware of how these sensors work, these have a little resistor inside them that either the resistance goes down or up based upon the air intake temp that it's reading. And then the computer basically interprets that data to know what the temperature actually is. Unfortunately, on this HP tuner system, you cannot just input the resistance data that this sensor has, so it was reading about 40 degrees too high. Now, what I had to do was I had to find a mopar air intake temp sensor that had the same scaling as a factory sensor. Now, why couldn't I just use the factory sensor? Well, on these cars, it's basically a push-in style sensor that just pushes into the air intake tract itself. And with a boosted application, that would just go boo, blow right out. So there's no way I could use one. I needed to use one that would actually screw in. Well, on the HP Tuners forum, I did find that there is an older style air intake temp sensor for like a Jeep Grand Cherokee or something like that. I'll go ahead and give you guys the part number for this here. But this is a screw-in style sensor and it reads exactly the same as this later model one does. So it works perfectly. I've already tested it and it reads our air intake temp properly. Now, air intake temp sensor is an important piece of data, but by far a more important piece of data when it comes to a speed density based system like this one is the map sensor itself. Now, again, I thought I could just use kind of whatever sensor I wanted to. So I used one that's very common among the industry, and that is a GM 3-bar map sensor. And I figured I could just scale it in the HP tuners and it would all be fine. Again, not accurate. So I think that's the majority of our issue right here, is that the map sensor is not reading correctly as far as how much air is actually in the system, and that's why we're unable to get this thing running. Hey there, Sky from the future here. Spoiler alert, the map sensor is not actually our problem. All right, let's get back to the present. By going back and looking at the data logs, basically I can watch a recording of when I'm trying to start the vehicle. I noticed that on startup procedure, the fuel injectors are working perfectly. They're giving exactly the amount that I'm asking it to, but as soon as it actually tries to fire the engine, the injector pulse width goes all the way through the floor. So I'm pretty sure that basically my air readings are just way off and not accurate. So I need to switch it to a Mopar style 3-bar map sensor, and that's what I have right here. This is actually an SRT caliber map sensor, which is a 3-bar map sensor. I will give you guys the part number right here, and this will work with our HP tuner setup, and it will work with the settings I already have in that computer. All right, we're gonna nerd out about map sensors for a couple of minutes, so if you're not interested in learning more about that, go ahead and skip forward. I'll put the timestamp on the screen right here. So I'm talking a lot about MAP sensors here. What does MAP even mean? Well, it stands for manifold absolute pressure. So what this sensor is doing is saying, hey, based on the pressure that I feel inside your intake manifold, I'm saying you have this amount of air and therefore you need this amount of fuel to match. Now, if you have a speed density system, you are using a MAP sensor. Now, this is different from a MAF sensor, which is manifold airflow. That's a totally different style. But most Dodge vehicles use a speed density system with a MAP sensor. So real quick, I'd like to give an explanation about what I'm talking about when I say 3-bar MAP sensor. What does that even mean, 3 bar? Well, bar is actually just a unit of measure, and what it's talking about is atmospheric pressure. So down around sea level, the atmospheric pressure is about 14.7 psi. So 14.7 psi equals 1 bar. Now, if you buy a vehicle that's naturally aspirated, then the computer system in there, the MAP sensor, is likely only going to be a 1-bar MAP sensor. That means it can read up to atmospheric pressure. Naturally aspirated engines cannot exceed that amount, so it works just fine. But the moment you introduce some boost via turbo or supercharging, then that MAP sensor is going to go beyond its scale and you won't be able to tune the vehicle for boost operations. So you need to add a MAP sensor that has that capability to read into boost levels. There's a bunch of different kinds of MAP sensors you can get: 2-bar, 2.5 bar, 3-bar, 4-bar. I think it even goes beyond that. But essentially, a 3-bar MAP sensor does not mean that you can read 44 psi of boost. What it means is that you can read up to atmospheric pressure and then 2 bar past that. So 29.4 psi is the maximum of what a 3-bar MAP sensor can read, which in my case is going to be more than enough. So to give you a better visual representation of how this works, you have to think about how a naturally aspirated engine works. As it's running, it's pulling that air into the engine, right? So that's generating a vacuum inside the intake manifold. So any naturally aspirated engine is going to be running basically in a vacuum at all times, and even at 100% efficiency, it's basically just going to approach atmospheric pressure, which could be referred to as 0 psi. So a 1-bar MAP sensor reads from basically engine vacuum, negative 14.7 psi, up to 0 psi. That's a 1-bar MAP sensor, and that's what most naturally aspirated vehicles have. Now, a 2-bar MAP sensor, as you can imagine, reads that same amount of vacuum up to 0 psi, and then it can read another bar past that, which is 14.7 psi. And following logically here, a 3-bar MAP sensor can read that same negative vacuum here all the way up to 29.4 psi. So there you have it, 1-bar, 2-bar, 3-bar MAP sensors. Now, a question you might have is, why don't all vehicles come with a MAP sensor that's capable of reading up to 3-bar right from the factory? Because that way you would be able to turbo or supercharge them and not have to change all this stuff. Well, I'll tell you, it basically comes down to resolution, which is essentially how finite of control you actually have over your fueling. Let me explain that a little bit more. So inside your factory PCM here, you have a fuel table, or in the case of these Dodges, it's actually a VE table or volumetric efficiency table. We can go into that at a later date, but just think about it this way, that this is your fuel table. So you've got this fuel table here that reads full vacuum all the way up to 0 psi on your MAP sensor. And then on this side, you have your vehicle RPM, let's say 500 RPM up to a limit of 6,500 RPM. It is a 10 by 10 table. Now, they're not all 10 by 10, but this is just giving you an example. So let's say you have a 10 by 10 table. So you have 100 cells that can basically capture any load point of the vehicle. Let's say you're at 5,000 RPM and you're under kind of a mid load. Okay, you're gonna be about in this cell right here. So it'll give you about this amount of fuel that's in that value, or somewhere in this range. Now, as you can see with 100 different data points here, you're always going to be in pretty close to one of these cells. So it's going to be able to blend that data pretty well and actually make the vehicle run smooth in pretty much all situations. Now let's see what happens if you add a 3-bar MAP sensor to a naturally aspirated vehicle. Okay, so in our example here, you have a naturally aspirated engine that you have now converted to a 3-bar MAP sensor on there. Remember, it is only a 5-volt sensor, so basically, let's say it'll read 0 volts at full manifold vacuum and 5 volts at 29.4 psi. These are not accurate, these are just representations to show you that. Okay, now you realize that with your engine being naturally aspirated, you can't make anything over atmospheric pressure, so your entire vehicle run is going to be down here in the bottom third of this graph. Now you can make these increments smaller here and basically still have a 10 by 10 table, but you've lost a ton of resolution down here because now you're only using a third of that 5 volts of the sensor here. So like what, 1.6, 1.7 volts, that's all you're using that map, and it can't differentiate these cells well enough anymore. So now what's going to happen, the vehicle is going to run more poorly because it can't choose a specific cell to work within. You're going to be jumping between a bunch of different cells all the time, and it just won't have that level of control that you would have had if you were only using a 1-bar map sensor like the car came with factory. So in our final example here, we have a boosted vehicle. We have a 3-bar map sensor on there. Now, why wouldn't we go with a 4-bar or a 5-bar map sensor? Why not get the maximum size sensor that we possibly can? Well, again, it comes down to resolution. Now, because we are dealing with 3 times the range now of airflow, now each of these cells is 3 times the size they were trying to cover that, because again, you only have 100 data points total for the full table. So you've expanded these cells so much that at any specific point, it'll kind of hang out in one of those data points for maybe longer than it should before it transitions over into the next one. So again, it's just not as fine of control if you go too big on the data point that your map sensor can read. So when you are planning a project, you really want to think about how much boost am I actually going to be running on this vehicle. If it's not going to be over 14.7 PSI, go with the 2-bar map sensor, because that will still give you some really good resolution and make your fuel table work even better than if you just kind of went for a 3-bar, because you don't need the 3-bar. If you're not going to exceed 14.7, you'd have a whole part of this data point here that you're not even using. So why would you do that? All right, so you can't make some of this stuff up. This is absolutely crazy. So right here on the back of the supercharger, this is where the factory map sensor goes on the 0304 Cobra. Now, I didn't want to use that map sensor because it was just a 2-bar map sensor, and I knew I was going to go over 14.7 PSI eventually at some point with this, so I wanted to use a 3-bar map, and I was like, okay, well, I'll just have to make something work. So I built a block off plate for where this map sensor attaches to, and I mounted the GN 3-bar behind the intake underneath because it has a remote line going to it. Now, I was just testing some things. I was gonna have to make a new plate here for the supercharger because I was going to try to mount this map sensor to it, which this map sensor, as I mentioned, is from a SRT Dodge Caliber. Well, I was like, I should just try this anyway. And wouldn't you know it, this map sensor fits perfectly in this location, and the bolt hole lines up to go ahead and cinch it down. I cannot believe that. That is absolutely ridiculous, but how cool. It saves me a ton of time trying to create a mounting plate for this thing that will bolt right up. All I have to do is do the wiring for the plug and we're set. Well, I gotta be honest, you guys, the last couple weeks have been extraordinarily frustrating. Now, I have been trying with the HP tuner system, trying all these different settings, trying to figure out why won't this thing keep running, but no matter what I did, the result would remain the same. It would start and then stall. I cannot tell you how frustrated that made me. I would say I was pulling my hair out, but you know, no, seriously guys, I was in a tough spot and I was getting kind of demoralized about it. But that is kind of the great thing about the internet, right? If we ourselves don't know a lot about something, there's other people who do, and we can get in contact with them. In this case, I made a post on the HP Tuners forum. Now, this forum is filled with some very knowledgeable people, and they're all willing to help. What's great is that you can upload your current tune onto the site. They can take a look at it and see if they see anything that's not quite right in there. And I got some fantastic responses, two of which I think will make a massive difference and hopefully get this thing to run. Now, the first of these is that a user on that forum looked at my tune and said, hey, something's a little bit wonky with your injector data in there. And basically what I had done was I had taken a Hellcat tune and just transposed basically those values exactly to my injector scaling. And I thought that would probably work out just fine. And he said it would have, but there's something kind of weird about the injector scaling, like almost like it was working off of a sliding scale instead of a static fuel pressure. So what he did was he tracked down a Trackhawk tune that has the exact same injectors in it, and he noticed that those injector data looked much more like he would have expected to find. And what he said was you should probably use the Trackhawk data, because that data basically gives you a little bit more injector down low, which I think will really benefit this car. But then another user chimed in, and I think that what he mentioned is actually going to be the real solution to the problem that we're actually having here. Now, to explain that, I have to tell you that on this vehicle, I don't have any of the factory oxygen sensors. I just have the wideband sensor that I installed. I thought that'd be fine because I was just using this vehicle in open loop. Now, I'm gonna explain open loop versus closed loop a little bit later, but essentially I was like, hey, the oxygen sensors aren't important in open loop, so who cares if they're connected or not? However, it appears like that was incorrect thinking, because this user chimed in and said, hey, if you don't have the factory O2 sensors plugged in, at least the upstream ones, the vehicle thinks that it is dead rich and it'll just shut off the injectors altogether. And that's basically exactly what I'm seeing when I look at the data logs on the vehicle. You can see that the injectors are getting their startup pulse width, and as soon as the engine fires, they basically shut off completely and the vehicle stalls, as you saw. So then the solution to this is to actually reintroduce our upstream O2 sensors on this car. Now that's easy enough with the wiring is still there, but I do need to add a couple of oxygen sensor bungs to the exhaust itself. Now I'm not going to be adding one on each bank, primarily because I don't have room for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install both of them in the crossover tube that goes from the passenger side over to the driver's side. They'll be spaced about 6 inches apart from each other, and this way they should have a reading that's pretty much identical to each other. Hopefully this will solve our start and stall condition. I feel really positive about it. Let's get into it. Okay, let's talk about open loop versus closed loop. What does that even mean? Well, when your vehicle fires up when it's cold, it is in what's called open loop. Basically, it's taking a reading of a few different sensors, and then it's saying, hey, based on this data, I'm gonna go to this chart and say, you need this much fuel exactly. That is what open loop is. Then after the vehicle warms up a little bit and the oxygen sensors get heated up, they start delivering some data back to the PCM, and it enters what's called closed loop. Now in closed loop, you have short-term and long-term fuel trims. So essentially how this works is as you're driving around, your oxygen sensors are constantly making readings. They're basically just ping-ponging back and forth between rich and lean as you're driving around. And it's saying, hey, if I'm spending more time rich than I am lean, well then I'm gonna go ahead and back down your fuel a little bit in this area of the fuel map. That's what's called a short-term fuel trim, because it's saying just for the time being, that's what I'm going to do. Now, if it does that for long enough though, if it's consistently pulling the same amount of fuel in that same area of your map, then it's going to transfer that information to your long-term fuel trim data and adjust the base fueling table for that area. And so basically it's constantly tuning on your behalf when you're driving your vehicle. Now this is most noticeable, like say, if you drive to a place with higher elevation, your oxygen sensor is gonna be working overtime to actually pull fuel out of your vehicle so that it still runs the way it's supposed to with the air that's available. Then when you drive back down to a lower elevation, it's gonna add that fuel right back in, so again, your vehicle runs properly. It's actually a really nice system. There we go, we've got our O2 sensor bungs installed here. You can see that they are actually slightly offset at each other so that they're not interrupting each other's airflow pathway. Ideally, these O2 sensors are going to read identical to each other. That would be much simpler. So those are all well in. Let's go ahead and get this crossover pipe reinstalled. All right, very cool. You can see here with a minimum of fuss, we have gotten our O2 sensors installed. You can see where I placed them. They're not in the way of anything else. They're not gonna run into anything, so that actually worked out really well. Basically, all I have to do now is wire up the plugs here to plug these guys in. We can see if that was truly what is going to fix our vehicle. So the last adjustment I need to make is we do have the AEM wideband gauge that is showing me what the wideband is doing, but I want to be able to record that data. So I do have a ProLink cable that actually goes to the HP Tuners unit that actually plugs into your data link connector. That will allow me to record the information coming out of the wideband sensor. That way, as I'm out driving this thing, I can do a full data log, go back and review the information and then make changes accordingly. So that's the last thing to do, and then we're gonna try to run this thing. All right, I've got the new injector data on the computer here with the Trackhawk data in there, and I've also got those upper O2 sensors installed. Let's go ahead and attempt to fire this thing up. This is my very first try with it. I really hope this works. I don't want to keep fighting with this particular issue. Obviously, we're going to make some more tuning changes as the vehicle runs, but it needs to run for that to actually happen, and I want you guys to hear this thing running and idling as well. Come on, baby. Dang. Well, you guys, this is definitely one of those situations where you could get really discouraged and get your head down because it feels like you're going down one blind alley after another. I've tried all these different things in the car, was having no success whatsoever. But finally, I did actually find out what the actual problem was. Now, remember when I told you in the last episode that I didn't want to show you what I was doing on HP Tuners because I didn't want to be giving you guys wrong information? Well, that's exactly what happened. I was the problem the entire time. Basically, one of the settings that I put into the tune itself was completely wrong, and it was causing the entire problem. Let me show you what I was talking about. So I brought up a data log on when it would start and stall. You guys saw what was happening. It would start, run for a second or two, and then die. Start, run for a second or two, and then die. So you saw the physical representation. Now I'm going to show you the data side of what exactly was happening with the engine and why it wouldn't continue to run on its own. So one of the primary aspects of when you're building a tune for a vehicle you're going to have is a VE table. This is volumetric efficiency table. Now you can think of it kind of like a fuel table, even though that's not exactly it. That will at least give you the idea. But the point is here is that any given RPM or vehicle load, you're gonna land in one of these cells or close to it that's going to tell the vehicle how much fuel it needs to actually run. So there's different values in all of these cells for each different scenario that the engine could find itself in. So the values that are in this table are basically percentages of efficiency of the engine. Now, you can think that even at idle, you're never going to drop below 55 or 50% efficiency. However, take a closer look at the data log here and see exactly what was happening with the car. Okay, this may be somewhat difficult to see on the screen. I'll see if I can make it as clear as I can for you guys. You can see here these spikes right here. This is the vehicle starting and stalling over and over again. This is all the attempts I made to actually start the vehicle. Now the red line here, the faint red line, that is my RPM signal. So the RPM jumps up and then goes right back down when it stalls out. Now it was apparent that the vehicle was not getting enough fuel to actually stay running, but I was like, why is it not changing when I'm changing that VE table? Well, I want you guys to really focus on these values right over here. That is total VE. So you can see right now they're at 15% right there. Now this is for each bank of the engine. So they're at 15%, and you'll notice that on the VE table, you never have a number as low as 15%. However, in the tune itself, when you're building it, there is a minimum VE value that you can input, and from the factory, that number is 15%. Now, watch that value here, right here, as I actually go through trying to start this vehicle. All right, so now RPMs come up. The vehicle fires. We're now at 1800 RPM, but notice that the total VE value has not changed at all from 15%. So then the engine stalls. I start it again. It stalls again. And notice that even though the other engine values are changing, the actual VE value does not change from the VE minimum that is in the tune of 15%. That is why the vehicle will not run. So in the end, guys, the problem was me all along. It was something that I had inputted into the tune that was actually reverting basically the vehicle to the minimum VE no matter what I did. It was some value somewhere I inputted that I made a mistake. So the only way to correct this was I had to go completely back to a stock tune and only change the things that I was actually certain of what I was doing. So I rescaled the injectors, I rescaled the map sensor, I put in the new VE table, I swapped over the spark table from a Hellcat because I knew that was going to be approximate as well. And wouldn't you know it, after I did these things, it started up and ran on its own. Now, since that time, I've continued to receive help from the people at the HP Tuners forums. In fact, there was another user there. His name is Warren. I want to thank him very much. He sent over a brand new tune for me to try. I actually just uploaded that and fired it up, and it's definitely in the ballpark. So I think we're going to start with that tune and start modifying from there. All right, you guys, there's no question that this has been an absolute battle just to get the car to this point. But as you can see, I have the front bumper back on. The car is actually washed for the first time in about 10 months. And that tells you that I have something going here. This vehicle actually runs and drives now. We're about to take this thing out for its first drive. Now, the tune I have in there now was basically an amalgam of help I've gotten from various different people, but it's at least given me a starting point to work with. Now, this is as good a time as any to mention that that professional that I was going to take the car to be tuned, to have this thing done up right, well, he very politely told me no, he's not interested. So that was unfortunate. But even though that is kind of a bummer, I'm not too upset because now that the car can actually run and drive on its own, I can pick away at it myself and try to make improvements and learn along the way. And that's something I'm always interested in doing, is learning more, especially on the tuning side of things. So I'm excited about that. All right, we're gonna fire this thing up so you guys can hear it right now, just sitting in here idling, and then we're gonna go take it for a spin. Now, I have to say that I think I might have achieved my goal almost a little bit too much. This thing is so quiet when it's running with the cutouts closed. It literally sounds exactly like a stock Hemi. So as you can tell, the vehicle runs extremely quiet, which is awesome. It's kind of exactly what I was going for. Very tame, very subtle when you're just cruising around. I think it's going to make an excellent street vehicle. You can hear there is a rubbing noise, and I think that's due to one part of the exhaust that must be contacting the frame somewhere. So that needs to be addressed. I need to put it on the rack and figure out exactly where that's coming from. Oh, that's a good sound. There's no question about it. Now, I do notice that my boost gauge is only going to about 7 pounds here. So I'm not sure if if I don't have the same wastegate spring in there that I thought I did, but it definitely is only going up to 7 pounds and then basically just stopping right there. So I'll need to get that figured out. But honestly, even for being completely untuned, it drives pretty well. Woo, man. Okay, so she definitely needs to be tuned. She's not exactly the smoothest car you've ever heard in your entire life, but it's functional. It's driving, which is a huge bonus compared to where we were last time around. So I feel pretty good about that. We're gonna chip away at this thing. We're gonna make those minor changes that are needed to actually get this thing running the way it should be. I gotta be honest though, I don't think we're going to have time to get this thing on a dyno before the Redwood Rally event. I don't even know if this thing's gonna be completely dialed by the time we get to the event. So that's my primary focus, is to make sure I make that event with the car. So we are still going to dyno the car no matter what. That'll happen, but I'm just saying it probably won't happen before the Redwood Rally event, which, if you'll remember, is at the end of September. So that's pretty much where we're at right now. That is fun though. But in the meantime, in our next episode, the next thing we need to do to this car to get it ready is I need to install the limited slip in the rear differential. So I did buy an aftermarket limited slip from a company called Traction Concepts. So we're gonna go ahead and get that installed. I need to order some drag wheels and some drag radials for this thing so that we're actually ready for the track. That was by far my biggest regret when I did Rocky Mountain Race Week a couple of years ago, is I did not actually get a set of drag slicks for that truck to see what it could actually do, and I had traction problems the whole entire week. So this time around, we're gonna rectify that. We're gonna actually get the right wheels and tires we need, and that's pretty much it, you guys. So I just wanna say thank you so much, as always, for following along with this crazy project. but we are heading towards, I don't know if you call it the finish line, but something close to that. So anyway, I appreciate you guys. We'll see you next time on Reignited.